Your daughter spends all her time on personal projects instead of focusing on her coursework. Frankly, I think she's wasting your money and should consider withdrawing before she fails out entirely," Dr. Hoffman announced to my parents in her cramped office, her voice carrying the particular condescension of someone who had confused administrative authority with actual expertise. "I've been advising students for 18 years, and I know a lost cause when I see one. Nadia isn't serious about her education." My mother's face crumpled while my father's jaw tightened, both of them absorbing the professional assessment of their daughter as a disappointment, a failure, a waste of the savings they'd scraped together for 15 years to fund my degree. But why did I sit silently through Dr. Hoffman's lecture instead of defending myself? And why, exactly 6 days later, when the Dean of Research summoned Dr. Hoffman to an emergency meeting, did the color drain from my advisor's face when she learned what my personal projects had actually accomplished? The meeting happened in Dean Okonkwo's office on the 4th floor of Morrison Hall. I wasn't supposed to be there. The summons had been for Dr. Hoffman alone. But the dean had specifically requested my presence, and Dr. Hoffman had been too confused to object. "Dr. Hoffman, thank you for coming on such short notice. Please sit." The dean's voice was warm, but her expression was serious. She was a woman in her 60s, with silver locks and the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. "I understand you recently advised the Okafor family that their daughter should consider withdrawing from the university." Dr. Hoffman shifted uncomfortably. "I recommended they consider all options. Nadia's academic performance has been concerning. Her GPA is 3.7. Yes, but her engagement with coursework has been minimal. She spends most of her time on personal projects that have nothing to do with her degree requirements." "Interesting." Dean Okonkwo opened a folder on her desk. "Let me share what I've learned about those personal projects." The personal projects had started during my freshman year. I was a marine biology major at the University of Southern Maine, a small program that most people had never heard of, tucked away in Portland on the rocky coast where the Atlantic crashes against granite shores. My parents had wanted me to attend a prestigious school, somewhere with name recognition, somewhere that would impress their friends and neighbors back home in Lewiston. But USM had something the Ivy League couldn't offer: direct access to the Gulf of Maine, one of the fastest warming bodies of water on the planet. Climate change was rewriting the ocean's story in real time, and I wanted to be there to document it. The research had begun as a genuine personal project. During my first semester, I'd started cataloging the shell composition of local mollusks, clams, mussels, oysters, comparing samples from different locations along the coast. I was curious about how ocean acidification was affecting their ability to build shells, a question that seemed simple, but opened into complexity the deeper I looked. I'd spend weekends collecting samples from Casco Bay, Scarborough Marsh, and as far north as Acadia when I could borrow a car. I'd stay up late in the lab, analyzing calcium carbonate structures under microscopes, documenting variations that nobody seemed to be tracking systematically. The university had undergraduate research programs, of course, but they were competitive, selective, and reserved for students who had proven themselves through coursework first. Freshmen weren't supposed to have ideas worth pursuing, so I pursued them anyway. The first paper emerged during my sophomore year. I'd accumulated 18 months of data: shell thickness measurements, carbonate saturation levels, temperature correlations, and I'd noticed patterns that didn't match the existing literature. The shells weren't just thinning uniformly. They were developing structural abnormalities that suggested the organisms were attempting to adapt but failing in specific, predictable ways. I wrote it up, formatted it according to journal guidelines, submitted it to Marine Ecology Progress Series, one of the top journals in the field. The rejection came 3 weeks later, but the reviewer comments were encouraging. Interesting methodology, insufficient statistical analysis, recommend major revisions and resubmission. I revised. I learned statistics I hadn't been taught. I resubmitted. The second rejection was closer. The third submission was accepted. I was 19 years old and I had a peer-reviewed publication. I didn't tell anyone. Not my parents, who would have been confused about what it meant. Not my professors, who might have felt threatened or skeptical. Not Dr. Hoffman, my assigned academic advisor, who had already decided I was unfocused. The publication felt like a fluke, beginner's luck that probably wouldn't repeat. I didn't want to claim achievement that might evaporate, so I kept working. The second paper came from a collaboration I hadn't expected. A researcher at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution had read my first publication and emailed me, apparently not realizing I was an undergraduate, to discuss methodology. Dr. Patricia Reyes was studying similar questions about shellfish adaptation in warming waters, and she thought my approach to documenting structural abnormalities might complement her work. We exchanged data. We co-authored a paper. It was published in Global Change Biology. Then came the citation. A team at MIT referenced our work in a paper about predictive modeling for fisheries collapse. Then a group in Norway. Then researchers in Australia, Japan, Scotland. The little project I'd started collecting shells on weekends was becoming part of a global scientific conversation. Dr. Hoffman had no idea any of this was happening. Our mandatory advising meetings were perfunctory, 15 minutes twice a semester, where she reviewed my transcript, noted that my grades were acceptable but not exceptional, and reminded me that I should be more engaged with my coursework. "You seem distracted," she'd say. "What are you spending your time on?" "Research," I'd answer. "Undergraduate research programs require faculty sponsorship. Have you applied to any?" "I'm working on my own projects." "Personal projects aren't going to help your career, Nadia. You need to focus on what matters." She never asked what the projects were. She never inquired about the specifics. She had decided I was wasting my time, and no evidence to the contrary penetrated her assumptions. The meeting with my parents had been precipitated by a scheduling conflict. I'd missed 3 classes in 1 week, not because I was slacking, but because I'd been invited to present at a research symposium at the University of New Hampshire. It was a small conference, mostly graduate students and postdocs, but Dr. Reyes had recommended me, and the opportunity to share my work with actual scientists felt too valuable to miss. I'd emailed my professors to explain. 2 had been understanding. 1 had not. Dr. Mitchell, who taught oceanographic methods, had reported my absences to my academic advisor. Dr. Hoffman had interpreted the absences as confirmation of her existing narrative. I was unfocused, uncommitted, wasting my parents' money on pursuits that had nothing to do with my education. She'd contacted my parents directly, inviting them to a meeting to discuss concerns about Nadia's academic trajectory. The meeting had been devastating. My parents had driven 2 hours from Lewiston, missing work, their faces tight with worry. They'd sat in Dr. Hoffman's office listening to her professional assessment of their daughter as a failure in progress. She's not engaging with her coursework. She's missing classes for what she calls personal projects. Her professors describe her as distracted, absent, not present in discussions. But her grades are good, my mother had offered weakly. Grades aren't everything. Academic success requires commitment, focus, presence. Nadia isn't demonstrating any of those qualities. What should we do? Consider whether this is the right environment for her. Sometimes students need to step back, gain maturity, return when they're ready to take education seriously. She was recommending I drop out. Not because I was failing, my GPA was 3.7. Not because I was struggling, I understood the material better than most of my classmates. But because I wasn't performing engagement in the way she expected. Because I was pursuing questions she hadn't assigned. Because I was building something she couldn't see. I'd sat silently through the entire meeting. Not because I didn't have a defense. I had publications, citations, a collaboration with one of the most respected researchers in my field. But something stopped me from presenting that evidence. Maybe it was pride. The need to prove myself through results rather than arguments. Maybe it was anger. The realization that Dr. Hoffman had never once asked me what I was working on, had never displayed curiosity about my actual activities, had constructed a narrative about my failures without gathering evidence. Maybe it was a kind of test. If she was right about me, if I really was wasting time on meaningless projects, then her assessment would stand. But if she was wrong, the truth would emerge eventually. I believed in evidence, in documentation, in letting the data speak. So I stayed silent and let the process unfold. Dean Okonkwo's discovery of my work had happened by accident. She'd been reviewing citation metrics for the marine biology department, part of her ongoing assessment of research productivity. She'd noticed that USM was being cited in papers from major institutions far more frequently than their small program would suggest. Tracing the citations led her to two papers with an unexpected author, an undergraduate named Nadia Okafor. I assumed it was a mistake at first, she explained during the meeting in her office. Undergraduates don't typically publish in global change biology, but I checked the university email records and there you were. A junior in marine biology, corresponding with researchers at Woods Hole and MIT. Dr. Hoffman's face had gone from confused to pale. I don't understand. She never mentioned. Did you ever ask? The question hung in the air. She said she was working on personal projects. I assumed. You assumed they were unserious. You assumed a 20-year-old couldn't be producing work worth reading. You assumed that your assessment of her engagement was accurate, without investigating what she was actually engaged with. The folder Dean Okonkwo had assembled was comprehensive. 2 peer-reviewed publications, 47 citations in other papers, an extraordinary number for work less than 2 years old. 3 institutions that had reached out about recruiting me for graduate programs: MIT, Stanford, and the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Ms. Okafor's research on mollusk shell adaptation has been described by Dr. Patricia Reyes of Woods Hole as some of the most important observational work being done on climate impacts in New England waters. Dr. Hoffman's hands were trembling slightly. I didn't know. She never told me. Because you never asked. You saw a student who wasn't performing in the ways you expected, and you concluded she was failing. You recommended that her parents withdraw her from the university, a student who was being recruited by 3 of the top marine science programs in the world. My mother had started crying at some point during the recitation, not from sadness this time, from something else. Confusion, maybe, or pride finally finding a place to land after years of not knowing how to interpret my choices. Nadia, why didn't you tell us? I didn't want to make claims I couldn't support. The publications felt like luck at first. I wasn't sure they meant anything. They mean something now, Dean Okonkwo said. They mean this university has a student producing graduate-level research as an undergraduate, building a body of work that established professors would envy. And they mean Dr. Hoffman owes you and your family a significant apology. Dr. Hoffman's apology was awkward and incomplete. I clearly misjudged the situation. I should have asked more questions before drawing conclusions. You should have, Dean Okonkwo agreed. Academic advising requires understanding what students are actually doing, not just what they're supposed to be doing. Nadia wasn't disengaged from her education. She was engaged with questions more sophisticated than her coursework addressed. I was trying to help. I thought she was struggling. You thought she was wasting time because her priorities didn't match your expectations. That's not the same as struggling. The distinction landed visibly on Dr. Hoffman's face. The aftermath of that meeting reshaped multiple trajectories. Dr. Hoffman was reassigned from advising to purely administrative duties, a demotion that she accepted quietly, apparently recognizing that her judgment had failed catastrophically. My parents returned to Lewiston with a different understanding of their daughter's choices. The years of worry, of confusion about why I was always collecting shells and staying late in labs, of not knowing how to interpret my unconventional path, all of it suddenly made sense. I wish you'd told us, my mother said during the drive home for Thanksgiving. We could have supported you better. I wasn't sure there was anything to tell. Research doesn't feel real until someone else validates it. 47 citations sounds pretty real to me. The university's response was unexpectedly generous. Dean Okonkwo nominated me for the Chancellor's Award for Undergraduate Research, the highest honor the university could bestow on a student. The selection committee agreed unanimously. The award ceremony happened in May, just before graduation. I stood at a podium in the university's main auditorium, facing an audience that included faculty, administrators, students, and my parents, who had driven 2 hours again, but this time for recognition rather than intervention. Nadia Okafor represents everything we hope to cultivate in our students, Dean Okonkwo said in her introduction. Not just academic achievement, but intellectual courage, the willingness to pursue questions that haven't been assigned, to build knowledge that nobody asked for, to contribute to human understanding simply because the questions mattered. My acceptance speech was brief. 4 years ago, I started collecting shells on the beaches around Portland. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just knew that the ocean was changing and I wanted to understand how. Nobody told me to do this research. Nobody assigned it. In fact, my academic advisor recommended I drop out because she thought my projects were distracting me from what really mattered. She was wrong about what mattered. But she was also operating from assumptions that are common in academic environments, that learning happens only in classrooms, that knowledge comes only from authorized sources, that students need to prove themselves through prescribed pathways before pursuing their own questions. Those assumptions almost cost me my place at this university. They almost convinced my parents that I was failing when I was actually succeeding in ways the institution couldn't recognize. I'm standing here because one administrator decided to look at the evidence instead of the assumptions. Dean Okonkwo traced citations and found a story that contradicted the official narrative. She asked questions that my advisor never thought to ask. That's the lesson I'll carry forward. Assumptions are comfortable, but evidence is true. The stories we tell about each other are often wrong. The only way to know what someone is actually doing is to ask, and then to listen when they answer. Dr. Hoffman was not in the audience. I'd been told she had a scheduling conflict, but I suspected the truth was simpler. She couldn't face the public recognition of a student she'd recommended for withdrawal. I felt something unexpected about her absence. Not satisfaction, but sadness. She'd been an obstacle, yes, but she hadn't been malicious. She'd been operating from a framework that couldn't accommodate what I was doing, and rather than expanding the framework, she'd tried to shrink me to fit it. That was a common response to the unfamiliar. Easier to assume the student is wrong than to question whether the system might be incomplete. The graduate program offers had been real. MIT, Stanford, and Scripps all extended invitations for their doctoral programs, each offering funding packages that would have seemed impossible 4 years earlier. I chose Scripps, not for the prestige, though it had plenty, but for the location. La Jolla, California, where the ocean was different but the questions were the same, where climate change was rewriting marine ecosystems in ways that needed documentation, understanding, response. You could go anywhere, my father had observed when I made the decision. Why Scripps? Because they have kelp forests. I've been studying shells in cold water for 4 years. I want to understand what happens in warm water too. Always more questions with you. That's what research is. Questions that lead to more questions. You never finish, you just get better at asking. The departure from USM was bittersweet. I'd spent 4 years in that small program, mostly ignored by the faculty who were supposed to be mentoring me, building something they hadn't noticed until it became impossible to overlook. Part of me was angry about the years of invisibility, the advising meetings where Dr. Hoffman had dismissed my work without inquiry, the professors who had marked me as disengaged because I was engaged with questions they hadn't assigned, the institutional blindness that would have ended my education if Dean Okonkwo hadn't stumbled across the citation data. But another part understood something more complicated. Institutions aren't malicious, they're just limited. They have frameworks for recognizing certain kinds of success and fail to recognize others. Students who color inside the lines get praised. Students who draw their own pictures get overlooked. I'd drawn my own pictures. The institution had eventually noticed, but only because external validation forced them to look. That pattern would repeat throughout my career. The work that mattered most would often be the work that didn't fit expected frameworks. Recognition would come late, if it came at all. The validation would be external before it was internal. That was fine. I wasn't doing research for recognition. I was doing it because the ocean was changing and someone needed to document what was being lost. The last conversation with Dr. Hoffman happened by accident. I ran into her in the corridor of Morrison Hall 2 days before graduation. She was carrying a box of office supplies, evidence of her reassignment, the physical manifestation of her diminished role. Nadia. She stopped, clearly uncertain whether to acknowledge me or keep walking. Dr. Hoffman, I want you to know, I never meant to harm you. I genuinely believed you were struggling. I was trying to help. I know. You never corrected me. During that meeting with your parents, you never said anything about the publications, the citations. Why? I thought about the question carefully. Because I wanted to see what would happen when the evidence emerged on its own. I'm a scientist. I believe in letting data speak rather than arguing from authority. That's a generous interpretation. It's the accurate one. I wasn't testing you. I was trusting the process. If my work was real, it would be recognized eventually. If it wasn't, then maybe you were right about me. Dr. Hoffman's eyes were wet. I wasn't right. I was spectacularly wrong, and I'm sorry. I know, and I forgive you. But I hope you'll remember this when you're advising future students. Ask what they're working on. Listen to their answers. Don't assume that your framework captures everything worth doing. I'll remember. The flight to San Diego happened in August. I watched Maine disappear beneath the clouds, the rocky coast, the cold Atlantic, the waters where I'd spent 4 years collecting shells and documenting a changing world. New questions waited in California. Different ecosystems, different challenges, different ways for climate change to unravel what had existed for millennia. But the fundamental work was the same. Observe, document, understand, share. Build knowledge that might help someone else make better decisions. Contribute to a conversation larger than any individual career. The research I'd started as a freshman continued to ripple outward. 5 years after those first shell collections, the work had been cited over 300 times. It had informed policy discussions about Maine's shellfish industry. It had contributed to predictive models that helped fisheries managers anticipate where populations would collapse and where they might adapt. I hadn't solved climate change. Nobody was going to solve climate change with shell measurements. But I'd added a few pieces to the puzzle. I'd helped people understand something they hadn't understood before. That was enough. That was everything, really. The memory I carried from those USM years wasn't the award ceremony or the vindication. It was the morning walks along Casco Bay, picking through tidal pools in the gray light, the smell of salt and seaweed, the cold water numbing my hands as I collected samples. It was the late nights in the lab, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the satisfying click of the microscope adjusting into focus. It was the moment when patterns emerged from data, when the story the shells were telling became clear, when I understood something that had been invisible before. Those moments had nothing to do with recognition or validation. They were the pure pleasure of discovery, the fundamental joy of research. Dr. Hoffman had called them personal projects, as if that were a criticism. She was right that they were personal. She was wrong that personal meant unimportant. The best work is always personal. It comes from questions that won't let you sleep, from observations that demand explanation, from the stubborn conviction that understanding matters even when nobody's paying attention. She told my parents I should drop out because I was wasting their money on personal projects. She said I wasn't serious about my education. She recommended I withdraw before I failed completely. She never asked what the projects were. The personal projects had been published in 2 peer-reviewed journals. They'd been cited 47 times by researchers at institutions around the world. 3 doctoral programs were recruiting me based on work she'd dismissed as distractions. When the dean discovered the truth, Dr. Hoffman's career quietly ended. My career was just beginning. But here's what I learned. Institutional blindness isn't malicious. It's limited. The frameworks that recognize some kinds of success fail to recognize others. Students who follow prescribed pathways get praised. Students who pursue their own questions get overlooked. I was overlooked for 4 years. Then the evidence emerged, and everything changed. That's the power of documentation, of letting data speak, of trusting that true things will eventually be recognized, even when the people who should recognize them are looking the other way. The ocean is still changing. I'm still documenting it. And the questions that started in those cold Maine tidal pools are still leading me toward answers I haven't found yet. That's what research is. That's what passion looks like when nobody's watching. Dr. Hoffman saw distraction. The dean saw contribution. The difference wasn't in me. It was in who bothered to look.